Welcome to this latest installment in the International Free Expression Project's Visionary series of online conversations with people who are defending free expression rights around the world. I'm Greg Victor. I'm a longtime journalist and the founder of the Free Expression Project. Today, we're hosting a conversation with Zoe Titus, one of Africa's most prominent figures working to advance the freedom and development of independent media, and Wallace Chuma, a Zimbabwean journalist and scholar, now teaching journalism and media studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Before introducing Ms. Titus and Professor Chuma further, I'd like to say a few words about the Free Expression Project. We are dedicated to promoting the right of free expression by leveraging our own initiatives and those of allied organizations. Our four core projects are to build a home for free expression in the former press room of an historic newspaper building in the US city of Pittsburgh. We're calling it the Marketplace of Ideas. We also are working to erect the world's first signature work of public art symbolizing free expression that would be located near the marketplace at the confluence of three rivers. We also are sponsoring the development of new, immersive, interactive educational tools that we plan to make available to advocacy organizations and educational institutions around the world. And we are supporting artists by commissioning and exhibiting their work. Okay, let's talk about Wallace Chuma. Professor Chuma holds degrees in English and Media Studies from the University of Zimbabwe and a PhD from Witwatersrand University in South Africa. His research areas include contemporary journalism, media policy and regulation, and media and political transition in Southern Africa. Prior to becoming a media academic, Professor Chuma was a journalist working in Zimbabwe for the Daily News and then as editor of the Zimbabwe Mirror. I got to know Wallace when I was an editor at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where I hosted him for 5 months when he was an Alfred Friendly Press Fellow. This was back in 2002, and at that time, he was under threat for having exposed corruption under the regime of dictator Robert Mugabe. I remember in particular that he published photos of police looting white farms under the name of land reform. Not long after he returned to Zimbabwe, Wallace was forced into exile and moved to South Africa. Zoe Titus is director of Namibia Media Trust, a Pan-African media development training and advocacy organization. The trust promotes a free and sustainable media climate in Africa, where independent media can prosper and contribute to the building of inclusive societies. It seeks to ensure that citizens have access to credible information upon which to make democratic decisions. In September, Ms. Titus was the first woman elected chair of the Global Forum for Media Development, an international network of journalism support and media development organizations. She previously had worked as a reporter and editor for the Namibian, and for 15 years with the Media Institute of Southern Africa, where she launched numerous initiatives. Among them was the SADC Journalists Under Fire campaign, which organized opposition to repressive media laws and the persecution of journalists in Zimbabwe, such as Wallace Chuma. For her tireless efforts on behalf of journalism and independent media, Ms. Titus was recognized by IFEX, the global network of free expression organizations, in its Faces of Free Expression project. An illustration of Ms. Titus by artist Florian Nicole was commissioned, and her story was enshrined along with those of other free expression heroes on the IFEX website. You can see the Faces project at ifex.org. Now I would like to hand things over to Wallace to interview Zoe. We've asked them to talk about their life's journey, the state of media freedom and free expression in Africa, the work that they and their collaborators are doing to improve the media climate, and what their vision and goals are for Africa. So I give you Wallace Chuma.
Thanks a lot, Greg, for the introductions. And thanks for the opportunity to interview Zoe. It's an absolute honor. Zoe is very well respected in Southern African media, in African media circles as well. Her story is very long. We don't have a lot of time. We've got 30 minutes. So I want our listeners, viewers, to benefit as much as possible. Zoe, I want to be quite open-ended here, but let me start with you telling me your story. How did this journey start?
Wallace, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you, and also to our host for making this opportunity available. Well, for me, it was always going to be one of two things. It was always going to be either law or media. And I think I have settled, where I've settled is a happy medium between the two, because you have to have a very good understanding of the legal framework in order to make any kind of impact on media policy and freedom of expression. So yes, I am very happy and very comfortable where I am. But just as an aside, someone asked me the other day, tell me something that nobody knows about you. And I said, well, it's not really about me, but my father was born on the 8th of March, International Women's Day, and my mother on the 3rd of May, which is World Press Freedom Day. Wow. So I think the heavens came together, and I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I am very fortunate in the sense that I'm particularly passionate about what I do. So it's a labor of love every day. Yes, in terms of my career, I started as, a rookie journalist at the Namibian, which has a very illustrious history itself. The Namibian is well noted for the role that it played in the liberation struggle of Namibia. I mean, I still think that is advocacy journalism at its best. So I had my stint at the Namibian, and I then left the Namibian to join MISA, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, where I was for 15 years, and that's a very, very long stint. But I really grew up, let's say, at MISA. I had the opportunity then to end my stint there as the regional director, and it gave me an opportunity to really appreciate how the national struggles were amplified to the region, to the continent, and globally, and also to see the intersectionalities between what we are doing in media freedom and other sectors, and how these link. So you had to have a very broad view and an appreciation of the right to freedom of expression. I think, does that answer your question?
It does, but we are going to go to more specifics, by the way. But I want you to tell me this. What is freedom of expression to you, and why is it so fundamentally important?
I don't make a distinction really when it comes to freedom of expression and access to information, for example, because I mean, you have to have access to information to be able to articulate yourself from an informed perspective. But I think for us in Africa, in Southern Africa specifically, the right to freedom of expression is linked to the very personal struggles for freedom. freedom of association, freedom of opinion, just the right to be a human being and absorb your space in society. And that is what freedom of expression is for me. The right to be yourself, claim that right, express that right, and not be subjected to, persecution for, just being a human being.
As a journalist at the Namibian, and the Namibian has got, like you said, a very illustrious history as an anti-apartheid publication. Obviously, the anti-apartheid struggle was also a struggle for freedom of expression. So you lived through that, and you experienced the birth of Namibia, and of course, you know all the shifts that have happened since then. If you were to reflect on those struggles from the last days of apartheid through to today, what has changed in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of access to information, in terms of also freedom of the media in general?
Well, the end of apartheid in Namibia specifically, let's speak about Namibia, installed a constitution, a democratically scripted constitution, which is rights-based. And that is the fundamental difference between, pre and post-apartheid regime. The fact that all peoples are equal under the law, and that was not the case in apartheid South Africa. Apartheid Namibia. You have similar experiences of Zimbabwe. So, there's a common history that we share, particularly in Southern Africa.
Thanks a lot. So you are alluding to a very important point: the codification, of laws which say you've got freedom of expression. It's guaranteed by law. But Zoe, in some jurisdictions, freedom of expression only exists on paper, but there is no freedom after expression. What's your experience, of Namibia, but also of the region and of the continent, of the actual relationship between what's written in the Constitution and what's practiced, especially the consequences of expressing yourself?
Wallace, you are absolutely right, and it's so interesting to note the nuances in the different countries. Looking at Namibia, for example, many who study Namibia say that Namibians don't fully appreciate their freedoms, and that democracy on them, in fact, is wasted because they don't fully, challenge the parameters or the parameters of those rights, and that's an important aspect of the right to freedom of expression, because our democratic space is shifting all the time, and it all depends on how it is challenged, and citizens should challenge that right every day, I think. Then you look at a country like Zimbabwe. I suppose just because you are Zimbabwean that I'm always drawing these parallels, where many would say that Zimbabwe has become an authoritarian state, and that is because some fundamental rights, like the right to freedom of expression, is firstly being challenged every day by citizens and journalists, and that's why so many journalists are being locked up or persecuted in one way or the other on a daily basis. But I think to really get to the essence of it is that we have seen a lot of democratic backsliding in the region, all over the region. And I think if we just look at the last 2 years, COVID certainly has played a role in that, because we have seen a lot of laws justified being justified by the pandemic, all of a sudden infringing on the rights to freedom of expression, the right to assembly, the right to association, the right to free movement. These rights are there. They are enshrined in most of our constitutions, but it is incredibly important that citizens challenge those rights, because otherwise they would not serve a purpose.
Thanks a lot. Zoe, what do you see as the role of civil society organizations like MISA, which you're involved with, in defending that space? As you would know, in many parts of the region, political organization outside of political parties tends to be really sort of weak, unstructured. That's where civil society organizations come in, like MISA. Could you speak maybe to the role that MISA and other organizations have played and continue to play in safeguarding that space?
Organizations like MISA and others, but I mean, you're asking specifically about MISA, because MISA was more than just a civil society organization. MISA was also a social movement. I've always said that it was also a social movement. It's a movement that brought free expression advocates together for a common purpose. And the role that MISA played was extremely important, because at the core of MISA's work was just to, on a daily basis, document violations. I mean, it seems very simple, but first of all, you need to document the violations, study those violations, report those violations in order to make cases and legal cases to then support those the rights of those journalists who have been the target of in most cases, governments, but not in all cases. I mean, increasingly we're seeing threats coming from a myriad of sources. Civil society in Namibia, for example, is not as strong as it used to be. Namibia, before independence, had a flourishing, strong civil society movement that was very, very focused on that singular cause of attaining, an independent Namibia and rights, the liberation of the country. But came independence, civil society was usurped by government and other institutions. And so there is a relatively weak civil society. And that is a concern, because just across the border, for example, you see in South Africa just how vigilant civil society is, and how civil society is especially using litigation as an advocacy tool to right the injustices to people. I recently had a discussion with Leslie Jansen, who was formerly involved in the organization called Natural Justice. And one of the, I think, landmark initiatives that she was involved in was to get an agreement for the Khoi and Bushman people of South Africa on the use, or let's say traditional knowledge, of the rooibos plant. So, I mean, this is not the free expression realm, and I've mentioned intersectionalities before, and I don't think that we should operate in silos, but this is how civil society can make real change, because it is civil societies, non-governmental organizations largely, that are those pushing for equity, equality, and just societies.
I like the way you raise the issue of intersectionality and link freedom of expression issues to the broader issues of basically participation, citizen participation in life.
Indeed.
One of the issues that you would obviously be more qualified to speak to is the issue of funding for civil society, for all these activities. You're talking about litigation. And what we've noticed in the region is a decline of sort of formal civil society organizations, especially post-apartheid, post-independence. That decline has been marked in large measure by the drying up of funding. How do you, and obviously that also speaks to how locals, maybe citizens, own that struggle. Is there a way around this? Is there a way out of when you could perhaps reflect on your experiences of just dealing with the question of funding to enable the activities and struggles that you go through?
Issues of funding, of development funding, multilateral, bilateral funding, it's been a challenge for civil society organizations for the longest time. The issue of sustainability is, I think, probably the biggest challenge that civil society organizations face, not only in this region, but in the global South, to be specific. We look at our context, let's say in Southern Africa, there was a lot of support from Nordic funders, firstly, and a lot of that support was attached to the anti-apartheid movement. And the need to strengthen civil society. So let's say if we look at the time frame or trajectory, a lot of those funders exited, let's say, Southern Africa after, let's say about 20 years after independence here, pretty much the same in South Africa. And they've not been substituted by new givers, for that matter. There is not a rich culture of philanthropy in Africa itself. So yes, funding for civil society is an extremely challenging issue. But to speak more broadly, with the Global Forum for Media Development, I'm very involved in supporting the understanding that there is a need to support public interest media. You cannot just support public interest media without supporting the infrastructure that supports it. And that infrastructure would include the civil society organizations and media development organizations that fund it. The nature of civil society organizations have also changed. The focus of the work, let's say the structure, or let's say the DNA of organizations have changed. The big, Uber organizations, in the way MISA functioned, let's say 10 years ago, are no longer sustainable because it just requires too much money to make them turn over. So there's a much greater focus on lean, mean, effective, and innovative ways of doing the work.
This is very exciting and interesting because it makes me think about the way the media themselves have changed. Because you're speaking to how civil society organizations have changed, movement towards being leaner, meaner, more innovative, etc., etc. Could you perhaps speak to the changes that the Namibian media, but also in general the Southern African media, have gone through thanks to the shifts in, say, digital ecologies, funding, the drying up of funding and advertising, technological pressures and other pressures as well. I'm sure many newspapers in Namibia have closed. Certainly in South Africa, several have closed down or have had to adapt and adjust, etc., etc. Can you speak to your experiences in that space?
Yeah, the sustainability of the media, it's a global challenge, and that's why this independent fund for public interest media is so important, because of the realization that there is a real need and a responsibility to support public interest media. Not all media, because I don't think all media justifiably should be supported. But I mean, this public interest role, that media plays just now, last year. Globally, we acknowledge that information is a public good, and I think that set us on the right trajectory to acknowledging that particular role that the media plays. But I mean, you're absolutely right. But Wallace, you think? I mean, I've looked at this and I've studied this for some time, and I think that discussion around digitization and its impact on sustainability of the media started a bit too late. I think the media was in free fall for probably a decade before the actual conversations started, and that we were all, trying to avoid the truth. But at the same time that I'm saying that, I still believe that there is a role for traditional media. I mean, in South Africa, the strangest thing, I mean, the Daily Maverick has brought out a print edition yet, but I mean, that's a niche publication. But I mean, the world is definitely going digital. We're talking about artificial intelligence, its role in the newsrooms. So to answer your question, in the case of Namibia, I think that here also, I think it's only the bigger media houses that will survive, those that have the reserves to ride the wave. But even then, there are challenges. What I've seen is that organizations that you would previously have considered mortal enemies are having to collaborate, to, for example, share distribution infrastructure, to come to advertising agreements, jointly work on developing, digital platforms. So it's definitely brought more collaboration to the fore, certainly a lot more collaboration to the fore. Very interesting reasons brought to the fore, a lot more solidarity amongst journalists themselves. So yes, I mean, it's a digital world, and everyone is just trying to make ends meet at this point. I still fear that there is a lack of innovation. What I do see, on the other hand, is that our traditional, large media houses, I think, are probably at some risk, because there are so many small startups that are doing exceptional and innovative things, which some would probably call NGO media. But this challenge has also opened up many opportunities, and then this is what we see.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Zoe. As you were saying that, I was thinking about situations like Zimbabwe, where by and large, mainstream media, like your newspapers, even radio and television, have become sort of, not necessarily redundant, but their role has become so limited because of the policy and legal environment. But within that context, you have had the rise of individuals, like, individual journalists who command followings on Twitter and who do investigative journalism as individuals or as a group of small individuals, and actually attract attention and change to an extent. A role that was traditionally assigned to the mainstream media or even opposition parties. So do those kinds of interventions need or deserve sort of support from organizations like yours or funders? One, two, where do we put the issues around ethics and fake news in all this? Because we've got so much information, sometimes from sources like individuals who have not gone through formal training, of ethics, et cetera, et cetera. Could you perhaps speak to that?
To answer your question, firstly, whether or not these individual or smaller outfits or startups should be supported, yes, I do. I definitely think that they should be supported, and I mean, I think there's a proliferation now of what people would probably call non-profit journalism, but the real question is can that be monetized and can that be sustained? So a lot of the bigger media houses are not particularly concerned about them because they think it's a flash in the pan. But this is where the issue of trust comes in. So, I mean, for those legacy media houses who have the track record, they probably, let's say, don't suffer as much from the trust deficit as the new kid on the block. But I mean, that's yet to be seen. If there were a public contest, then we'd figure that one out. In terms of, this tsunami of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, I think it's very, very difficult for all citizens at the receiving end to try to make sense of all of this. I mean, with this information overload, the real question is, what can you trust? And that is why I advocate very, very strongly for support to public interest media, where there is a proven record of professional, ethical journalism. I think that would be it in a nutshell. And that is what I suppose there's a lot of information and awareness raising that needs to be done in that respect as well. Because, I mean, you also have a lot of fact-checking outfits out there, but fact-checking is always playing a catch-up game. It never, a fact-checked piece or a verified piece never goes as far as the original fake news that went viral.
Zoe, in this sort of winding up now, against this whole sort of background of lots of uncertainties, what would you think, what would you say, is the likely future of freedom of expression in Southern Africa, on the continent, against this background of uncertainty? What should, it is fundamental, it's important, but is it, are we on a good course? What would be required if we are going to keep sort of safeguarding that freedom? Because, like you said, it's constantly contested and struggled and fought for. What is the future of freedom of expression on the continent?
I think that for those involved in promoting freedom of expression, we are on a journey that will evolve dramatically in the future, and we need to be very open to change. One of the things that is very evident at this point in time is that there's a rise in authoritarianism, there's a rise in surveillance, and that the right to freedom of expression really is under threat. So we have to be tremendously vigilant in what we do and how we go about promoting the right to freedom of expression. But I think going forward, and I've been advocating for the longest time, is that we cannot work in silos, because we are also operating in a region we have some of the highest poverty levels, where injustice is so acute. So if I'm going to go out in the street and speak to someone who doesn't know where their next meal is coming from, talk to them about freedom of expression, they would be very offended, because they don't see this as bread and butter issues. So we really, really have to look at ensuring that there is a sound understanding of freedom of expression and how fundamental it is to our survival and development, and reach out to like-minded individuals from different sectors, because collaboration, working together, is going to take us forward. There are great forces, I think, stacked against us. So we have to work from the perspective that we are stronger together. That strength with innovation must be foregrounded. The future is bright, but we will be shaping that future in the way that we tackle this, this fight to ensure that everyone has the right to freedom of expression.
Thanks a lot, Zoe. It was an absolute honor to interview you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wallace. Lovely speaking with you.
Thank you both, Wallace and Zoe. Really stimulating conversation. Just love the way that you provided a really sweeping view of both the importance of free expression, of media freedom, of where we are now, where the state of play is in the digital age, with misinformation, all the complications that we have to deal with, almost kind of like redefining what free expression and freedom of the press means in our time, and how do we promote it. And I was really kind of moved, Zoe, by your description of how you see free expression, to the point of how you said it really is just so essential to being human. We're social animals, we have to connect with each other. And that I love the term, we need to be free to absorb our space. And I think also then we must allow other people to absorb their space. So I really appreciate all the territory you covered in a fairly short amount of time. And thank you very much. We also, in mentioning the importance of collaboration, I feel as though, at the International Free Expression Project, we want in everything we do to have a spirit of collaboration. We want to, we don't want to do what other organizations or individuals are doing. We want to do things that we think up and can do to help the cause, but we really want to take the materials, the activities, the ideas that other organizations are working on, the casework of, organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, the work that the Global Forum for Media Development is doing, and kind of accelerate that, do whatever we can to publicize it and help give it more force. So, Zoe, Wallace, anything that we can do at any time to help your work, we'll keep an eye out for what you're doing and try to help where we can. But anything you would ask us to do, please do. And to wrap up, I'd like to also thank Colcom Foundation in particular, which has supported our Visionary series, all of our collaborators on many fronts that have made the work of the Free Expression Project possible, and our audience today. So thank you again. Goodbye, everybody. Be well, stay safe.